Hello and welcome to another video. In this one, we're going to be talking about Podman and how it relates to Docker, mostly the differences, but also, the similarities because they're very, very similar. But anyway, let's jump into it. Okay, so today we're talking about Podman. Podman is basically a different implementation of Docker. Now, to some, those words would be blasphemy. It's really an implementation of the open container spec and blah blah blah. But anyway, for the layman, you can think about it as just Docker but different. And we're going to talk about two main differences today. I'm going to just show you some examples of using Podman, and in a lot of ways, it uses the same exact command line as Docker, so it's very familiar if you're used to the Docker command. So, for instance, Podman run rmti ubuntu focal bash. This will run a container where you have root inside the container, and it's separate from your outside operating system, and it works basically the same. You can also do podman build and basically all the other Docker commands that you would want. And in fact, on my machine, I have Docker symlinked to Podman, so I'm actually, I have a little bit wired in my brain that I use the Docker commands, but I have them just symlinked to Podman. But anyway, I want to talk about the differences between Podman and Docker and kind of demonstrate them using, an actual machine that has Docker installed on it. So the two main differences between Podman and Docker, or at least when you're considering it from a infrastructure perspective, is that Podman is both rootless, which means that you can run it as an unprivileged user without needing special system privileges, and it is also daemonless, which means that there is no stateful process that needs to continue to run on your machine. So if we do psef grep podman, you'll see that, well, it found my grep process, but you'll see that there is no podman running. It doesn't stay running on my machine, and because of that, it's a little bit easier to manage from an infrastructure perspective. Now, if we switch over to Docker on this other VM, so you notice things actually look a little bit different. This is because I've been experimenting around with a different terminal emulator. Oh, and spoilers. I'm supposed to show that yet. But Docker is a daemon, and the way it works is if we do psef grep Docker, you'll see that there is this Docker D, the Docker daemon, and it is running as root. And the way that Docker works is you interact with Docker D to spawn containers, and then you kind of translate over an API to figure those out. And the way the API works is there's a special socket file at var run docker.sock. And you'll see this is owned by root and the Docker group. So you can actually add yourself to the Docker group to access this, which kind of allows you to escalate to root via this Docker socket. But so this is again like being rootless, Podman being rootless is a security benefit because it allows you to isolate your users a lot more. Whereas with Docker, if your user has access to Docker, they essentially have access to your entire machine, because Docker runs as root and can do things as root. But anyway, there's this daemon that's running here, and there's this socket, and you can interact with this socket. Actually, curl, this curl command saved from before. So I'm running sudo curl. Again, I need sudo here because I'm not part of the Docker group on this particular box. I could add myself to the Docker group, and then I'd have to reboot and do all that, and then I could do this without sudo. But anyway, let's I digress. So sudo curl, that's going to allow me to use curl. I'm curling against this Unix socket, so this particular socket here, and I'm using the HTTP API. Docker is actually implemented using a RESTful server behind the scenes, and so all of the Docker commands are actually sending JSON over this socket and communicating with Docker D in that way. So you'll see if I run this and pipe it to JQ, we get a bunch of information about the Docker D version that I'm running. In particular, I'm running 1903. This is a really terrible color scheme. This is probably why I didn't use this upgraded terminal emulator. But yeah, you'll see like you can query the endpoints here, and that's the same thing that you would get if you ran sudo docker version. What it's actually doing behind the scenes in this sudo docker version command is it's going out to this daemon socket endpoint and querying it there. And so that's the daemon part about this. Now you'll note when I run podman here, I didn't require any sudo here, and there was no daemon running. There's nothing. There's no socket to communicate with. It's basically just a normal Unix process that happens to spawn these specialized containers. And yeah, those are the main differences. Rootless versus rootful, and daemonless versus daemonful. And being rootless has a bunch of security benefits, and being daemonless makes it easier to manage, an installation of that. So I find that Podman is kind of nicer in both of those things. But anyway, that's kind of the TLDR for the differences between Podman and Docker. There are a ton more because they are completely different implementations. But those are the basic ones that I think of from like an operational perspective. Anyway, hopefully this was useful. If there are additional things you would like me to explain, leave a comment below or reach out to me on the various platforms. But thank you all for watching, and I will see you in the next one.